Great. Welcome everyone to our Trimble webinar this morning. My name is Allison McDuffie. I direct education outreach efforts at Trimble, primarily for the buildings group, but also civil engineering and geospatial. And Richard Hassler is here. He's a market manager in the geospatial group. And we're going to talk about a great project we've been working on now for almost 4 years, I think, around the transatlantic slave trade and sites associated with such. We did do a webinar, I think, about 3 years ago after we collected data from our first site. So this is going to be a huge update on the efforts of the last few years. I'd like to start off our presentation with this fact, really, from the Getty Conservation Institute. And losing cultural heritage sites worldwide really is happening at an alarming rate. And many of these sites all over the world have not been documented in 3D. So we're going to talk about what we're doing in the US and the Caribbean to help with some of those efforts. We'll start off, since we're US focused, on our efforts talking about, in the United States, these types of dwellings, which are former enslaved people's dwellings, their homes, throughout the 16th, 17th, 18th century, 19th century as well. These were where people lived on estates or plantations, and there are very few of these actually intact and left throughout the US. This particular one in South Carolina was dismantled and reconstructed and preserved, and now sits in the National Museum of African American History and Culture in DC. I saw this in person, and it's a pretty incredible experience. The whole museum is a pretty incredible experience, but this was especially of interest to me. A little bit of information about the slave trade. We're going to show a quick video on slave voyages, over 20,000 voyages, so these are individual ships, in the span of around 2 minutes, and we'll talk a little bit about some facts about the transatlantic slave trade. When Richard and I started on this project, I thought that I knew a lot about the slave trade, and I learned very quickly that I knew very little. So this has been pretty enlightening over the last few years to really grasp the enormity of this period in our history.
Each dot, by the way, on the screen represents a slave ship in its voyage across the Atlantic.
During this transatlantic slave trade, it was really a forced migration of up to 15 million people to the Western Hemisphere. And there have been, documented so many crimes against humanity, millions of deaths due to violent travel conditions, forced labor, torture, and murder. America's prosperity was built on the back of enslaved peoples. We can directly relate everything that's associated with our institutions today on being built from enslaved people. There's an enduring legacy of racial stereotypes and prejudices and racial violence, as well as Eurocentric views about Africa still exist today due to the slave trade. And of course, we all know there have been centuries of wars and politics have been formed around the issue of slavery. When you think that on each individual voyage there were anywhere from 200 to 500 people in the cargo hold of these ships, it's really this is quite the experience for me to watch this.
Okay.
Great. We can move on to the next one. So a little bit about how we got involved in this and what our focus and goals and all of that stuff were. We attended a conference in late 2013 in London that was focused on documenting world cultural heritage sites, and particularly through 3D laser scanning, 3D data being collected. We kind of organized with the folks who ran that conference, and we decided that since we make the equipment and the processing software to do this sort of work, that we wanted to be involved in some way. And so we ended up choosing this theme around the slave trade, particularly in the US and the Caribbean, because it's not something that had been documented before. So we have come to, over the years, focus more on actually slave dwellings as opposed to mansions or estate homes and that sort of thing. Those are all preserved, and you can go tour them in the Southeast at will, and you'll get lots of information about a plantation owner and their home, and it'll be outfitted with period things. But it's rare that you'll be able to go into a slave dwelling and get that side of the story. So that's part of what we're trying to do here. As I said, lots of structures around the world are lost to things like natural disasters, human aggression, just neglect over time, and they're not documented. And many of the ones we're doing are really around neglect more than anything. Let's see, one of the pieces of motivation for us also is that we get to showcase a lot of our technologies in a really unique way. I think you're going to see, Richard's going to go into a deep dive about the technologies later, and you'll get to see that we employ a lot of different things on a site, and then we come back and process and create outputs that are using a lot of different things. It's not just a laser scanner. So he'll go into that in just a second. It also allows us to engage with other people, historians. We'll talk about in a minute some of our partners, university folks, local communities, and to pull out and be able to create comprehensive case studies from it. We've been in a number of publications, blogs. We've talked at conferences and trade shows about this. And we also try and pull in our local regional partners on some of these projects to come to a site and help us document. So really is our goals are really telling this story through a new 3D lens, creating also curriculum, primarily K-12 curriculum that's free and accessible for teachers, and then to leverage partnerships and build technical capacity. Like I said, we actually documented our first site in the fall of 2014. To date, we've documented around 25 individual structures at 7 sites throughout the Southeast U.S. and the U.S. Virgin Islands, plus a really cool project that we did last summer in documenting an 18th century British tall ship, which is a replica that's at the Maritime Museum of San Diego and was in dry dock at the time. So you can see a list of the technologies, just some of them actually that we've used. And Richard, like I said, will go into more detail about that in a second. We did set some criteria for narrative and site selection, and the academic focus areas that you see here, around capture, confinement, transport, life and labor, and that sort of stuff was really something that from the beginning we defined. And we also, site selection criteria is around risk, how badly deteriorated is a place, is it at risk of being demolished, that sort of thing. We have lots of academic advisors and partners, which we're really proud of building over the last 3 years. The people that are kind of highlighted in blue here are the ones that we're most actively involved with. Dr. Peter Wood is a former professor at Duke University, and U.S. slavery is his topic. And he just happens to live here in Colorado, close by, and so we have great, easy access to his knowledge. Dr. Henry Lovejoy is a professor at CU Boulder, so he's right here as well, and he is an African Studies professor. And then Jopi Hill is an architect specializing in historic preservation, and she founded an organization called SavingSlaveHouses.org, and we have most recently been working a lot with her, which Richard will go into. But future partners that we're really excited about, the Slavery Images Database. If any of you have heard of that, or if you haven't, go do a Google search on it. But it is the most widely used database of illustrations and images from the times of slavery in the world. And so we're about to add some 3D data to that database, which is pretty exciting. And Henry Lovejoy at CU has just become the new director. We'll talk about that in a minute as well. And at Michigan State University, there's a big project going on, and we'll talk about that in just a second. We started out when we first got going with having this interactive map built out. It gives you kind of points on a map that are clickable, and you can see ports of departure, ports of arrival, and numbers of people associated with those voyages, as well as regions indicated by those large circles about numbers of people departing and arriving in a particular region. One thing that I was not aware of when we first started doing this project was the number of people that were transported from Western Africa to the Caribbean and Brazil. Wow. I mean, wow. 10 million people. I mean, it's crazy. So in comparison, number of people who were directly came from West Africa to the U.S. was far less, but many of people came from the Caribbean to the U.S. As well. This map is, I just want to say, is lived on a partner site, sciarc.org, and it's no longer accessible because they've kind of switched up their interface, but for a while that was being heavily used. Our first site was in Mississippi at Natchez National Historic Park. This is an estate home that had about 25 people enslaved and serving the owners there. And so a team of us went down, some local partners came with us, and we spent about 3 full days in sweltering heat and humidity documenting the site. And Richard will talk more about that in a minute. Some of the outputs on this site were this landing page on sciarc.org. This still exists, so you can go and search this on SciArc's websites under the Themes tab at the top there. And this 3D model is actually a SketchUp model that you can zoom in and out in orbit, and you can get more information about the site, the history of the site, and some data points as well. This shows the in-depth and media gallery links where you can go and see some walkthrough videos and other data stuff. So there was another site in Natchez that we documented called the William Johnson House. William Johnson was a man who was born into slavery and was actually emancipated when he was a teenager by the slave owner's wife, and lived throughout. Still, he was still lived through the times of slavery, died before the Civil War ended. So it's a really unique story, and we only know about it because he kept a very detailed diary. He became a really successful barber and businessman in Natchez, and so this is a historic site where he lived and ran his business. The second site we documented was on the island of St. John, and this is an old sugar plantation that was owned by Denmark. And this was really, really something to see. This site is at risk because the vegetation is overtaking it. And a lot of it, as you can see, is in ruins, but really significant historical site. You can see the team of people that were involved both in documenting and writing the history of this site as well. It's a national park, and the park geologist also hosted us, and we worked in tandem there. And this is some of the outputs on SciArc's website, and some more media gallery and in-depth information on that site. The third site that we documented was the McLeod Plantation in James Island in South Carolina. And these particular slave dwellings, this is an interesting location and site because it's run by people who tell the story of the majority of people who lived here, which were enslaved people. And there are not many places, as I mentioned earlier, in the U.S. that tell that story. They called this row of slave dwellings actually Transition Row because they were actually inhabited by people up until the mid-1990s. So there's a continuing story for another, century about these dwellings. And so they're wonderful people at this site. If you're ever in South Carolina, I highly suggest visiting this. It's quite the experience. So we took a group of teachers down here as well to visit from Boulder Valley School District. And this is some of the point cloud imagery of those same dwellings on the top mid up to the top right, and then the lower left side, a dairy building and a kitchen building, which were almost always separate buildings back in the day. So The next thing that we documented was this British tall ship that I mentioned, and these are just some images from that weekend spent doing this. Peter Wood is on the right, our historian from Duke, who came along, and one of our colleagues on the left, Brian Stutzman. And these are some of the scan data that came from that collection. And these are some of the other assets that were created. We had a summer intern on the SketchUp team from the University of Minnesota. Peter Kluzak is his name, who spent a considerable amount of time modeling, doing a 3D model in SketchUp of based on this slave ship, but actually using historic data from a ship called the Charleston. And so that's what this model is of, and these are some renderings that we're showing, in addition to the interior of the ship, which we think is a really important thing to see and to experience. And so we have taken this model into a HoloLens environment and also into a Google Cardboard environment. And the top right picture is a day we spent at a middle school here in Boulder, and of kids getting to experience that, going through this ship at a 1-to-1 or a 1-to-20 scale, or whatever you have the ability to do in HoloLens. So.
Just a quick insert here. The historian estimates that the density of the people in the lower right image is roughly 3/5 of what really would have been held in the hull of this ship.
Yeah.
So you can get some kind of feeling for what that weeks-long passage across the Atlantic would have been like.
Yeah, horrible, horrible conditions. You know, anyone who fell ill on a journey was pretty much tossed overboard. So pretty brutal conditions. This I talked about Google Cardboard and getting this model in there. And so this is pretty exciting stuff. This is an experience where you can, actually the scan data goes from RealWorks to Undet to SketchUp to a Unity workflow. And we're launching an alpha with test audiences this month on this experience. But essentially, if you go to the next slide, the red dot on the little inset there indicates where you are on the ship. And you essentially click through where you want to go. So this gives you an idea about what the experience looks like in Google Cardboard. And it's really important to have an experience like this in a device that is very inexpensive. K-12 schools will never own a HoloLens device, but they do actively use Google Cardboard. So. And then the next sites we documented were last summer and fall, is that correct?
August.
In last August, right. And this is work with Joby Hill, the architect that I mentioned earlier. She has a great organization. She is a powerhouse team of one who goes around surveying and documenting sites that contain slave homes. And so we've teamed up with her. We met her at a conference a few years ago, and she's been great to work with. So Richard and a few other people from our team went to Virginia and also spent a number of days in sweltering heat with machetes cutting back vegetation to get access to some of these structures. So some of the 3D images there, and I just want to show, this is a video that one of our colleagues, Jason Hayes, created that Joby submitted to the Smithsonian Institution as a proposal to get additional funding to continue doing this work, and with which we will help. So I'll let this run for just a minute so you can get an idea about what these sites look like in the beautiful data that was collected.
They're inside the slave ship, HoloLens.
Terrific reaction from kids on this. I mean, just completely enthralled. So. Please check out Joby's SavingSlaveHouses.org site when you get a chance. We talked a little bit about incorporating into K-12 curriculum, and so we've worked with a group of teachers from the Boulder Valley School District and an organization called Impact on Education that supports BVSD. And so a team, many of us from Trimble have made multiple visits to both elementary, middle, and high schools to talk about how you collect this type of data, what happens after you collect it, and how you create outputs that people can consume. So these are some photographs from some of those visits. And these are some of the lesson plans that live in both on SIARC site and on Impact site with BVSD folks as well. Really proud to say that once we got moving with teachers on this, both at the 5th grade level, at the middle school level, and at the high school level, 3 new courses were actually written and submitted to Boulder Valley School District Superintendent and were approved that address slavery. And so you can see at the top there at the elementary school, it was around the slave trade and social action, around a course called Human Rights at the middle school level, which includes the slave trade and other slavery around the world. And then at the high school, the history and impact of slavery. We talked about Henry Lovejoy, a professor at CU, and this is about the Slavery Images database, of which he's the new director. And so this is just some information about what we're looking to do with him, which is going beyond just JPEG images and actually adding something that's a little more immersive in your experience. And then Michigan State University just received a ginormous grant from the Mellon Foundation to do a proof of concept on taking primarily academic historians, disparate sites that address slavery historically. Everybody has a different specialty, right, in that area, and there are websites on platforms created all over the place, but there's not one landing page where you can go to kind of integrate all of those to get the whole story. And so they're working on that technological challenge, and they're in phase 1 right now, but our data sets will be included at phase 3. So this is a really exciting thing for us. And then lastly, what we're looking at as well is going ahead now. We have so much data, it's kind of in disparate places. And so we're looking at building our own landing page on Trimble.com within the geospatial area of our website. And so stay tuned for that to come. And now Richard will go into a much deeper dive about the technologies.
Okay, so you've seen snippets of each of the sites. I just wanted to talk about the technologies that were used to capture those sites and some of the techniques that we've employed along the way, and some additional discussion. The Trimble TX8 is figured very prominently in a lot of this work. Fundamentally, we scan and collect other data typically. We don't just collect the other kinds of data. For the Virgin Islands site, it was rather large. It was roughly a half of a mile long. And between the Annaberg main site and a secondary site that we picked up that was the master's house, total was closer to a mile long. But more importantly, it was on the side of a very large mountain. This is all part of the Virgin Islands National Park on St. John, and including some of the areas in the water, which are underwater national park and good for scuba diving and whatnot. We didn't get to enjoy and frolic the vacationer's life in this area. We worked pretty hard to capture the entire site as best we could. There were actually 4 different areas of collection on this project, and we wanted to try to tie them together. So we used the UX5, formerly Trimble drone that we used to have, a UAS system, and planned out very carefully how to fly this to provide a surface model for the context for all of the other scan data. And it is pretty tricky when you have a very large mountainside like that to plan your flight path so you don't fly into the mountain when you're trying to capture the images. So there was quite a bit of Google Earth planning. You can see on the lower right some potential flight lines that were being considered for the flight paths. And they looked at it both transverse the mountain and as well as along it. Okay, so once we got to the site, one of the very first projects we did was to do a very quick RTK survey, a real-time GNSS survey, to position targets on the ground that would be used to tie the imagery together. So when you're processing the photogrammetry, it helps to have a very tight control net of visible targets. In the upper left, you also see the launcher that was used to launch it, and that small little area, clearing area, is in the upper left of the lower photograph. It was the only area that was flat and clear enough for us to take off and land. And a few of the times that the aircraft wound up in the trees. So we sent the low man on the totem pole to climb up in trees with very large thorns to recover our aircraft because we weren't very good at flying it sometimes. Okay, so GNSS was used, aerial imagery was used, and you can see a snippet of the surface model, including that landing zone in the background, that is a part of the entire mountain, and we captured that entire mountainside. And as well, you can see where we took an aerial photo in the lower center of the master's house. So that was all mapped out using the UAS and provided a rough surface model. There's very heavy ground foliage as deep as 6 to 8 feet deep here. So perfect accuracy on the shape of the slopes wasn't what we were really after. It was more the context of what the scene looked like than anything. But we could then take the surface model along with the point cloud essentially that was derived of the master's house and use that to register laser scan data that was taken on the ground. So you have very high accuracy, high quality laser scan data inserted into the context of the entire mountainside. Okay, so I wanted to capture this scene just to show you that it's not all fun and games trying to get all of the little nooks and crannies of these buildings. Oftentimes you're standing on tops of high walls, trying to get into the corners of buildings that aren't exactly the friendliest or nicest places to be kneeling. There are a lot of thorns and wasps and hornets and all kinds of things and really hot temperatures. But also climbing down in the basements where some of the more historically interesting aspects of the buildings can be really nasty. And you can see Brian Stutzman on the lower right down in a little hole that was in one of the slave cabins in Virginia that I'll show you later. That hole was touted as being the most historically significant site in the entire county in Virginia where we were. And Virginia is a pretty historical county. It was an area where enslaved people had stored food, belongings, different things, and it hadn't been opened since 1960 prior to him climbing down in that hole. And we have a really nice little video that shows that so historians can look at it. It was amazing to see 5 or 10 historians all massed around this hole and climbing down in it and going, ooh, wow.
I can't imagine the number of spiders that were in there.
Oh, it was actually remarkably clean for that. Just to give you an idea how we do the collection, if you're not familiar with scanning, you can see Jason Hayes here working feverishly at trying to capture the deck of this ship. Running for a few minutes the TX-8, it does a complete scan. He's doing his best to stay out of the scan so we don't see Jason at every 10 feet on the ship deck, capturing the data. So this is made just to kind of show you how it's done. In a second, I'll describe a little more clearly what actually is done. And on the right is one of the cabins from our Virginia visit. If you look, you can see there's a camera array that we use. We take we could use the camera inside a TX-8, but we choose to use a high-quality SLR to do really high-quality color mapping to ensure we get a colorized point cloud that's really nice. So we take the scan, remove the scanner, and then use this SLR array, which puts the optical center of the camera right where the scanner is, and it captures this panorama. And when it's stitched together, you see it looks like this bizarre shaped panorama. Well, if you map that onto the inside of a surface of a sphere, it maps perfectly and looks like the sphere, and you can use that to map the color onto the laser scan points. So this technique adds a lot of time to collect the data, but it provides a much nicer result. So CyArk actually insists on doing this technique where possible for their data collection when they work with different groups. And we adopted it and have maintained doing it this way, which is the nicest result. So here you can see some colorized point clouds inside Trimble RealWorks. Once you have all the scans colorized, the next step is to piece them all together. Because when you set up a scanner, you just set up and hit go. And that essentially is working from a 0, 0, 0 coordinate system for each and every scan. And somehow you have to tie them all together. Well, inside our software and many other vendor softwares, they have routines that allow you to register. It's called registering the scans together to make one point cloud of the entire scene. So you only have line of sight from where you set the scanner up. So you need to work your way around, as you saw Jason do, behind different obstructions and stuff, so you get all sides of the area that you're trying to capture. And on the left is one scan in this image. On the right is a different scan, and I'm trying to piece those two together to make a coherent point cloud. And in the bottom, you can see the colors representing the different colors. Or the different scans mapped together or tied together in a registration. Okay. Once you have a coherent point cloud that you can move around in the software in 3 dimensions, it's very useful to try to remove obstructions that are in the way of you actually seeing the area of interest, or the object of interest. In this case, this is a cabin that was at the McLeod Plantation in South Carolina. And you can see that a tree over the years has grown to within inches of the roof of this dairy building. I mean, it is imminent that it's going to come down and take that building out. Very, very difficult to remove that limb. It must weigh tons. It's an enormous tree. But with point clouds, if you capture all around the sides of that tree, you can essentially just cut it out in 3 dimensions and eliminate it so that you can see what the building looks like without the presence of that large obstruction. That's very important to this work because quite a few of the areas that we work in are very, very heavily vegetated. So just to get an idea for how these colorized point clouds can look, on the left, we had a professional photographer with us taking pictures, and he took pictures of the faces of these cabins, each face. So we had very nice images to use for mapping for any models that we made using SketchUp and texturing the surfaces of those models. But additionally, he took this really nice scene image, and on the right, I tried to match it inside RealWorks for position and zoom state to show you how nice the point cloud comes out. And you compare the two, they're remarkably good. The difference is with the point cloud, I can just pick up and move and walk down that row of buildings and spin around and go inside the buildings, where you can't do that, obviously, with photographs. And I can make accurate measurements of anything that's in that scene. Okay, here's one of the sites. This was a very important site, in fact, that we captured with Joby Hill in Virginia. This is called the Green Hill Plantation, and it has been let go really badly over the years. The homeowners actually live in the building in the farthest in the back. You can see on the right, there's a large farmhouse there. And all of these other buildings, on the right-hand image, you can see the slave cabin. On the left side of it is the wash house. There's a chimney that was the remnants from the old kitchen building that served this plantation. And there's a sewing or materials room where they made fabrics and things on the back right. Now, this site is a very historically significant part of Central Virginia. It's really close to Lynchburg, and it was a breeding site, and it's on a small river. So they actually bred slaves here, and they would drop the slaves off at the river and walk them a half a mile up, and there were very large plantation grounds and barns and things along the way. And they got to what's called the upper village or upper town here, where the owner lived. And in the 60s, I've seen historical photographs of this site where everything you see was just dirt. It was around the buildings. It was used for grazing horses and cows and stuff. So there was no vegetation. If you look on the left, this site was so heavily vegetated that we couldn't even scan the buildings until we spent a day clearing them. So the wash house on the left was almost invisible. We almost walked by it without knowing a building was there. There was so much vegetation around it. So clearing the buildings so we got clear line of sight to the surfaces of the faces of the buildings was necessary. Once we got that, then in the software you can remove the remaining vegetation and have it look like this site is still open again and clear again. There's another interesting, I didn't capture it in this picture, another interesting historical piece of this site. Right in front of that master's house in the back, there's a pedestal where they used to auction the slaves. And it still exists, and he walks out his back door every morning and sees that right outside of his back door of his house. And it was placed in such a way that it was certain that this is the only remaining slave cabin, but there were others, and they all could see that auction block at any time, just to remind them that what could happen to them if they got out of line. Another view of that wash house. I mean, I pulled down a vine that was, I don't know, 3-4 centimeters around from the roof, and the entire covering of the roof of vines, this all came down in one shot and knocked me down. It was amazing how much vegetation there was here. Again, this is the chimney that used to be part of the kitchen, which was standing in the 60s. This kind of vegetation encroachment is exactly what we're trying to fight by capturing these sites now before they're gone. Because once it's gone, you can't see it anymore. You can see the quality of the mapped images inside the attic of that slave cabin. It's remarkable. I can do a 360 movie of this, and it looks like you're standing in the middle of the cabin almost and looking at it. Very high quality. This is a second image or second site, the Pharsalia plantation, and this cabin also had one of those holes in the floor where people could go in and store things underneath. Not many cabins have that remain in southern United States, so they're okay. Just a quick video to show you, if I can get my mouse to work, how scan data can be turned into SketchUp models. You can actually go in and pick points in the scan data in the Scan Explorer extension with SketchUp, and those points are carried into SketchUp itself. So you can see the points for the doorway he's mapping here show up, and then you can adjust the doorway to match the points that were measured from it. And this drawing, or this model itself, was created directly from scan data inside SketchUp using the Trimble Scan Explorer extension.
Which Richard authored.
Yeah. So quite nice. Chris Dizon and did it. Jason Hayes made a nice video of this, and Chris Dizon made a nice model. Okay. All right. So some other techniques were used when we were in Natchez, Mississippi. We were still selling the Trimble V10 imaging rover, and that allowed you to collect panoramic imagery. And from that imagery, you also had a GPS position on it, or total station position, and you could actually use the position of the cameras and a registration technique to determine the pose of every image. Once you do that inside Trimble Business Center, you can export to SketchUp all of those images, and the pose information goes with them. There's a view inside SketchUp called the Igloo view that lets you see this larger view in the screen you see here with all of the circles of images. And from that, you can pick any given image, and I'll show you very quickly kind of modeling technique. There are images, and then there's the model in SketchUp. So I can pick points and hop from image to image and see how the model aligns with the points, and I can actually draw that model or create that 3D model from the imagery alone. And the models that you saw earlier on the SIARC site and these models that are shown in here were completely derived from SLR images of the faces that Allison took of all the buildings using for the texturing, and the images taken from the Trimble V10 to give it positional accuracy.
This is called match photo in SketchUp.
And that specific technique you just saw there was using the match photo algorithm or tools in SketchUp. Okay, so we went to the McLeod plantation, did a lot of laser scanning. In addition to that, there was some V10 imagery taken of the side of the master's house, and that also there were some of the cabins captured. So I had the ability to kind of piece together the scan data together with a model that was created of the master's house. Now, most of this model that you see here was created using images pulled down in SketchUp by a master builder, Chris Dizon again, from images from the internet. So most of what you see in that model right there of the master's house was from internet images. All of the rest of this stuff was using the same Scan Explorer extension techniques and the images taken by Bill Kuntz, the professional photographer, for texturing to make the model. So we're marrying together several different techniques here to make one large model of the site, which I find fascinating, to be honest, and I'm not nearly artistically good enough to do that. Okay, so that's the end of our presentation material, and we're open and willing to answer any questions or any thoughts you'd like to present to us. Are there any questions that anyone's come up with?
Yeah, if you want to just type into the question area.
In the chat.
We'd be happy to
answer some questions. Otherwise, we assume that you got what you needed from our talk.
Could you cover again just the next steps on what you guys are looking at doing in the future?
Sure.
Yeah, I think one that I mentioned is that we want to create our own landing page on Trimble.com. We've worked with all of these different partners, and the outputs of what we've been doing have been living in other places. And so I think it makes sense now, this has been a long-term project at this point. We have, like I said, over 25 structures documented. And I think this is something that everybody at this company should be really proud of. And our partners, too, who come to sites to help us with this work. And so that's what I'm most excited about in our next steps. And then, again, the slavery images database, having 3D data on there, when that's the most commonly used resource for people trying to get information, is going to be really exciting as well. Those are the two big ones for me. Richard, do you know where we are with next sites that we might scan?
Well, as the video that you saw of the Virginia sites, in particular the Fossalia plantation, was being used in a submission for Joby Hill to get money from the Smithsonian, a grant from the Smithsonian, to continue work on the Green Hill plantation. We're hopeful that comes through, and we work with her to continue to collect some data on that site, because there's a lot that we weren't able to capture in the days that we were there. Other than that, we had discussions with these historians about what our future might look like in collecting data. And rather than randomly collected of different scenes, one of the ideas that we've been floating with the historians was to try to more or less follow the life of an individual.
That's true.
From the African coast and capture where they were put on the ships, more or less, that we have an individual in mind, to South Carolina, where that person was transported. They lived around that area. They actually moved to Cuba, I think, for a while, and lived a life of slavery there, I believe, and then became free or moved to England at some point. So we wanted to more or less, kind of almost like Roots in some way, capture the life of an individual and what that person's journey was, and document the sites that were significant to them along the way.
Yeah, stories are always so much more powerful when a real person is attached to them. I have to say, every single site that we've shown, you can see that the people on site documenting are just sweating like crazy, and really just terrible environmental conditions. And I couldn't help but think, especially on that first site in Mississippi, like how horrible it must have been to be working on a plantation in that sort of heat and humidity.
Yeah, it's terrible.
Set 24/7. And so I do think, if we can find the right story. The problem with finding a story about an individual is that these stories historically have not been important. They're not the ones that rise up that people know about. And so that's a bit of a challenge, and that's where we're leaning on our academic advisors to try and help. So I'm anxious to figure out if we can do that and actually.
So there are two. One thing I wanted to point out was everything you've seen here has been funded basically, other than these images database and stuff. All of the work that we've done to date was funded by Trimble. Yeah. So we're the ones who paid for all of this work to be done. Yeah. We'd like to try to find co-sponsors if possible, and that's part of what's driving that, or I think stagnated us a little bit right now, is trying to see if we can hook up. People like Joby, who, if she gets this grant, would be a co-sponsor then and help us pay for some of our expenses, would really be perfect. So other historians in that list that we showed earlier are also considering work like that. So
and I do have to say a huge shout out goes to all of our executive team here at Trimble, because all the way to the top, to Steve Berglund, they've supported this right from the very beginning and have funded it. And so it's, like I said earlier, I think it's something for everybody in this company to be proud of. And if you're a partner out there, or you're a Trimbler listening right now and you want to be involved, get a hold of myself or Richard. Yep. And you can do that by just emailing education@trimble.com and we'll get it. And so. Any questions? Let's see. Somebody's asking, is it possible to download point cloud data of this project?
Today, no. That's one of the things we'd really like, a hurdle we'd like to get. If you put in a request to SciArc, I believe you could get data. They stored the data from everything we did with them on the first two sites. Yeah. I could provide data for some of the other stuff if necessary. It usually takes a sending of a hard drive kind of a thing.
Yeah, it's massive
for these data, because they're very, very massive. Not just the scan data, but the images that go along with them are big. But it's our hope that if we can work with Henry and Lovejoy and or the Michigan State guys, that we will actually find a home where we can store the data and have it accessible to people for download and use.
Yeah, and universities that are, working on kind of IT infrastructure to store terabytes and terabytes and terabytes of data are exactly the places where that should live, to be honest, not on a hard drive, by Richard's desk. Well, plus a hard drive by Richard's desk.
That takes forever to upload to.
Any other questions from anyone out there? Great.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. I hope we learned something or enjoyed our talk.
Yeah, and I think this is being recorded, so if you want to share it with friends or colleagues, it'll be, where will it be, Michael?
It'll be, if you registered, we'll email you a link to the recording, and then if you just Google Trimble Geospatial Webinar, we'll have it archived on that website as well.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Okay.